Hi, how's everybody doing this evening? In this video, I want to take a look at a type of render that I've seen quite a lot on the D5 render forum and on the various D5 Facebook groups. And that's going to be something that looks a little bit like this. Let's bring up D5, and it's going to look kind of like this. You can see it's a pretty kind of conventional looking modern, I say that kind of loosely, modern home style build with some kind of nice architectural flourishes and features. And this is pretty consistent with a lot of the work that we see kind of, especially for beginner architectural renderer users or beginner students. And it's not terribly bad per se. And I feel like it's a pretty common scene for a lot of beginner users is to try their hand at building like a modern style home build. And it's actually, I'll show you, this was my very first architectural kind of render done quite a number of years ago at this stage. But you can kind of see why a lot of students will gravitate to this type of shot. The buildings are relatively easy to build, and you can kind of set up pretty basic cameras. And I'm going to talk about some of the mistakes that obviously are evident in this one, and talk about how if you, as a D5 render user or any other rendering software user, will go about making your scenes a little bit better. We'll take it from intermediate, or at least beginner, to intermediate, hopefully. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, everybody, so let's go ahead and just take a look at our first issue that we see here. And the first thing that kind of comes to mind when I look at this is really just vehicles. There is, I think, a temptation to try and make your render look effectively cooler by putting in really cool looking vehicles. And so you can see here we've got like 3 vehicles put in. For some reason, some sort of Lamborghini looking vehicle, maybe an Audi or a Tesla. And the simplest thing you can do right now is just get rid of these. I'm going to select all of them and actually just hit delete. There may be a time and a place when you want to put a vehicle in your shot, but you know, this is something I have to tell my students all the time. You're doing effectively product shot, but for buildings. Architectural rendering is just showing off the building, maybe within context, definitely, but you're not trying to set up automotive renders. So when in doubt, just kill the vehicles, just get them out of your scene. I think it'll look a lot better. Now, obviously, if you're doing a city, it's going to be slightly different. You may want to show movement or life in the city. But for basically what is, you know, a fancy commercial shot or just a residential shot, really not much need to have a vehicle centrally placed. All right, let's get rid of those. Let's move on. All right, everybody, moving on to the second big issue that I can kind of see is twofold. It's basically the horizon line and the lack of context. In other words, right now the building is sort of floating in a vague 3D space, but you can see the horizon line, and it's absolutely just kind of killing the sense of the building in an actual environment. So a couple of ways we can go about fixing that. So if we go back to SketchUp really quickly and look at our SketchUp model, you can see beginner users might have a very large ground plane. Let's go ahead and just select that. We're going to hit delete, and I'm going to unhide effectively some horizon blockers and context that previously existed. All right, let's bring this over to D5 and we'll see how this looks now. Next thing that the image is kind of lacking is some greenery, really just to add a little bit of context behind the home. Really, you know, you can just, even just generic broadleaf will do pretty good job of kind of just giving your scene a kind of pseudo context. Doesn't have to be perfect, and you know, you just put a little bit of tree in here. It's just gonna help just make the thing look a little bit better. All right, so with that done, we've got our trees, at least on the background placed. Now that will help give your scene a bit more context and just make it look a little bit more grounded in an actual environment. And we are still hiding that horizon line, and that's definitely something that you want to do. Now, another alternative to this is if I turn off my trees and we go back to SketchUp here, we'll take a quick look. Now, this is just another technique. I haven't really used this very much myself, but you can see here we've got some generic building shapes, and I'm going to send that back over to D5. And again, just turn this back on, and okay, In other words, what we can try and do here, instead of actually just using trees and nothing but trees, I'm going to select some of these buildings, and we could really just put maybe just a very generic gray material on them. And so you can kind of see here, if you were to look at this and maybe turn off the tree context, even just having something here is not terribly bad. It just looks like they're out of focus. You could also use Photoshop and blend between two different modes for doing this. So we could go to environment, and you could actually export just this AO layer. And you could see now, you could in Photoshop effectively just use a mask to paint out the areas sort of around the house, which would give you this sort of faded effect. It would focus the viewer's attention on the actual building. And again, these buildings are just going to be generic gray. They're just effectively non-entity blobs. But again, it just looks like your building is set in an actual surround. And I think that kind of matters more than the overall look. Could you mix and match these with the trees? Yeah, you probably could. It would still look overall, I think, better than just having really nothing there and seeing that horizon line. All right, let's go ahead and move on, and we're going to fix the actual lighting in the shot. You know, sooner or later, everything comes back to lighting, and materials will only get you kind of so far, and having all the context is really nice and it helps, but ultimately it comes down to an issue of lighting. And so you can see the first mistake with this is there are lights everywhere. And I see this a lot with, really with a lot of new D5 users, probably Lumion and Twinmotion and Enscape users too. There's a tendency to put lights just everywhere because, that looks really cool. And in certain contexts, it can actually look really, really cool. But here you've got, we've got things like, effectively strip lighting hanging out really under the ceiling, which is, again, something I do see people do this in renders. And we've just got all these spotlights all over the place. There's a lot of exterior spotlights in this scene. And they tend to just either come from really pronounced kind of basically IES lights, but are really just inset lights built into the walls. And then you've got lights like down here that just come from nowhere. They just materialize magically out of the floor. And you see this quite a bit. So how do we get rid of this, or how do we actually set up lighting? All right, everyone. So having removed all of the extraneous lights, the quickest and easiest way that I can think to light up a scene like this to make it look a little bit warm and inviting is effectively the use of really just these sort of like rectangle lights. And this may be just some bad habit that I picked up from using Lumion kind of back in the day, but like it's kind of not a bad way to light up your scene, is to really just place in a bunch of these really just rectangle lights. And so that's exactly what we have here. You can see that I've placed quite a number of them, not really strategically, but just with the intention of maybe having them kind of shoot light out towards a wall or having them point downwards. It's a quick and kind of dirty method just to get lights into the scene. And you can see that most of these are set to a pretty low intensity. I've got a couple that face walls, and I've got a couple that are really just kind of hanging from the ceiling. Now, I have turned the floating light, the pendulum or sort of pendant / chandelier light in the living room, into an emissive material just to give it a kind of a glow effect. And then I have at least put one sort of just like point light in that area just to add a little bit more. But overall, it's a super basic lighting setup. I've changed the emissive exterior lights that had point lights attached to them. Just get rid of those and maybe just adjust the emissive to be a little bit sort of less yellow. And I think that overall looks pretty good. Pretty happy with how things are looking, especially with our added tree context. All right, it's got a warm, inviting glow. And at any point, if we find that this sort of glow effect is too strong, we can just manually dim these lights. Now, I did increase the size of these to 2000. This will sort of exponentially increase the light. So if you have to drop that up to like 5000, and we take it all the way up, If you think of it as like a flat surface that is emitting light, that is effectively what these rectangle square lights are doing. And so you can also just adjust this by just putting this back down to maybe 1,000 by 1,000. You will get a less uniform distribution. It might look a little bit more harsh, but just something to be mindful of. Maybe you'll find a nice compromise here. I found 2,000 to be perfectly fine for me. 2,000 by 2,000 seemed to be enough to light up this shot. I haven't really made any changes to the materials on the inside either. There's wood on the ceiling and tile on the floor. You know, you would realistically want to set those up accurately instead of just kind of going by whatever default material is there. Okay, the next thing we want to mention is the sky. And again, going back to sort of my own reference point, which is sort of a lot of my own students, and also then kind of what I see other people do. Sunsets. Yeah, don't. Just stop. Sunsets might be the most overused thing that you'll probably ever see. They do look super cool, and I'm actually quite liking the orange glow that's coming from the left side of the screen here. But if you want to adjust the lighting, not just the individual lights, but the ambient lighting, you know, just steer clear of sunsets. They look good in certain situations, but just they've been done to death. And again, students, I think, and you know, beginners will often rely on them a bit too much because they look dramatic. And so it's like, okay, I want to make my shot look dramatic. I'll add a dramatic sunset in there. But again, the point of this is to show off the building. I would argue not necessarily showing off the sky. So we're going to go and change the sky. All right, everyone. So we have gone ahead and traded out our sunset sky for one that I think hopefully will look a little bit better. This is the Kloppenheim 06 Pure Sky, available from Polyhaven. Really great resource for you guys to use. I've adjusted the skylight intensity and the background, but again, we're just trying to really move away from having a very cliche sunset sky. And I think this one is working just fine. Now, there are a handful of other remaining issues that we want to address. The first is just the plants. You can see it's a very kind of beginner approach to laying down plants. Pick something nice that you like the look of and plop 4 of them down in a row, because, you know, you're sort of thinking that's kind of how plants are actually laid out. But this really just doesn't work very well. It gives kind of a very Lego village effect. And so, you know, these hydrangeas are lovely, but we can probably do without having them all arranged in a row. In addition, we also have a tree here, basically a Cercis just placed right here. And it kind of, again, it makes sense from a beginner point of view. Front yard probably has a tree. The placement, however, is kind of odd. It's just kind of shoved off to the side here, and it just doesn't really kind of fit in place. All right, everybody, getting close to the end now. If you've made it to this point of the video, thank you so much for watching. Really do appreciate really seeing the number of subscribers kind of go up and seeing more people leave comments and just, you know, interact with the channel itself. So thank you so much. Really do appreciate it. The last 2 things that we need to do is just take a look quickly at the updated vegetation. You can see we have moved our actual tree. We've replaced it with something that looks a little bit more natural in the actual scene. And we've placed some vegetation out the front. And you can see we've got a little bit of kind of a consistent sort of green and white theme going on. This is a look that I really, really like, and I think it just reads really well with a lot of renders. The vegetation has also been spaced in a bit more of a logical fashion, and we've ensured that there's a bit of variation. We've also made sure that some of the vegetation is actually crashed into the ground, so you're not seeing as much of the stalks coming up, or basically the root ball area, and this makes things look a little bit more natural and a bit more finished. Okay, with that being done, the last thing we want to look at is just some of the original textures that are in this model, and we're going to go and actually change them. We're going to add a few little bit of bits of wear and tear as well, just to make this look a little bit more natural. All right, let's bounce on. In terms of some of the material changes, I just want to go over these kind of briefly. I did change out the concrete on the wall here for something that I thought looked a little bit better and was hopefully less repeating. There's still a bit of an issue right here where you can see the texture doesn't line up perfectly, but it will probably be out of focus. I did also change really just this section right here, which would be the driveway, to something a little bit better than what the original sort of SketchUp model was, which was basically almost like this sort of flagstone material. And we also did change out this material here. And you can see I've actually got multiple different SketchUp materials here running along this section. And this is so that in D5, if you apply a material that has an awful lot of tiling pattern, this, by having it on individual sections, really just allows you to have each one set to a different offset. Kind of breaks up the samey pattern. I did add a few decals here as well. So we've got the obvious manhole cover, got a few cracks on the road. That could just be, you know, because I live in Austin, Texas, and the roads are kind of bad. But, you know, cracks in the roads just makes it look a bit more realistic. We do also have just this white road marking, and we've added some leaves in here just to look kind of like they've fallen and just accumulated on the side of the road. I've also added grass. This is, I think, just two grasses put together and just placed with effectively, let's say M on the keyboard here. And if we go to model and grass, it's a pretty simple kind of way to place these. So let's go to recent. And we will go to grass. And we're just using this ability right here to effectively stamp. It's setting the scatter tool, but effectively using it at its max radius will apply it direct to the surface. And I think overall that looks pretty good. Also, heads up to Nuno Silva, who was a big proponent of doing that early on. I think it looks pretty okay from distance. Now, pulling the camera back, I think we're in a good spot. I've added a few more imperfections here. You want to be kind of careful with the decals. Try not to make this thing look like it's really run down. Use very, very sparingly. All right, with that being said, let's bounce over to just some of the render settings real quick, and we'll get this wrapped up. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and wrap this up pretty quickly here. I'm going to unhide all of the groups with my trees and foliage. And let's just say we're going to work off this camera angle right here. So I am just going to position my camera, and I'm just going to go for something that I think will look pretty natural for right now. Going to refresh this on scene 2. I am going to fill in this gap over here on the right. I am actually going to put a vehicle back in there, even though we did effectively strip out all of the vehicles. It's just, you know, sometimes it's just nice to have a little vehicle in the background so it looks more realistic. So to do that again, let's just go down to our material browser tab here, and I'm just going to look for vehicles. There we go. And again, you want to avoid having something that just looks really like just unfeasible. So like when in doubt, just grab a vehicle here, and I'm just going to place this all into the scene. I'm just going to put it back over here and just drop it in the scene, and we'll rotate it, and going to turn off any sort of motion. We don't want it to look like it's kind of in transit, so we turn off everything here and turn off dynamic. And if we look back at our stored camera, yeah, honestly, it's a vehicle. I might even push it further back so there's no kind of attempt to see logos or anything like that. It's just to have it in the shot. But again, we're not putting in, like, you know, sports cars. All right, let's go to our environment tabs really quickly. Pretty happy with the overall look of the sky background. And I'm going to move myself out of the way here. There we go. I'm not going to turn on fog or wind or precipitation or any of that kind of stuff. We can tweak the skylight overall just to make it a little bit brighter or darker. You can see the effect that that's going to have. And again, we want to avoid that sunset vibe. So we'll go for maybe more of an afternoon look. That looks nice. All right, we're going to leave everything else intact. We could add an extra sun if we want, but, you know, I think I'm okay with the default lighting. Let's go to effect really quickly. Exposure, we'll just tweak this to get the overall look that we want. Again, you're looking for a brighter shot. Try and avoid that sunset look. I think that looks pretty good. We can mess around with a LUT or LUT. Basically, LUT is a lookup table. It's effectively color grading. That's my low-level understanding of this. And I'm just going to go to a custom one, and I've got a bunch of different ones here. And I'm going to look through the Fuji Eterna. These are, I can't remember exactly where I got these online, but if you just search for free lookup tables, you can get quite a lot. I think these may have come from fixthephoto.com. And they're just kind of nice. And we can plop one of these into our scene. And I'm just looking at the Fuji and Kodak. Let's see, maybe something, this, yeah, I kind of like the look of this 5218. So I can drop the intensity with that as well. And you can see the effect that that has at 100% or down to 1. So let's just put it at about 50 something. All right, looks nice. I'm going to adjust my camera settings here. We are going to turn on depth of field. We are going to set the focus on the actual house, not on the people or the background. And we're going to hit F8 to turn on 2-point perspective. And we'll refresh that in our updated scene. Now, back in the effects tab again, I'm going to just tweak these a little bit, just looking at the shadow. And please note, kind of what I see on my monitor might be a little bit different to you guys looking at it on YouTube. I make the shadows just a little bit darker. I do kind of like the sort of Lumion-esque look, which is very kind of deeper, darker shadows. I think D5 is a little bit overly bright on that regards. Again, that's just sort of my opinion. Highlights, let's take these back down to nothing. And bloom, I am not a fan of having a huge amount of bloom in this. I do like it on the, sort of on the lights right here though. So we'll put in just a little bit. You may find it easier to do this in Photoshop though. Lens flare, vignette, all that stuff, probably easier to do in Photoshop. But, since we're here, let's take up a little bit of the vignette. Chromatic aberration and saturation, I would really recommend do this in Photoshop for just a still image. It's cool that you can do it in D5, but just, do it in Photoshop. That's literally kind of what Photoshop is used for. Okay, everything else is looking fine, and I'm pretty happy with this. Maybe move the camera forward just a little bit more. I want to hide some of the edges, and I think overall that looks pretty good. There's probably more we could do to kind of fix this up, but I still think this is, just as is, a sort of improvement over where we were originally. Before I render this out, I might try some different lookup tables. I might try different cameras just to see what works best. But overall, pretty happy. Go to the camera mode. Again, just move myself out of the way here. And in terms of focal length, I'm pretty happy with this. Focal length, if you're new to D5, generally for exteriors, you may find something 15 millimeters around that. If we type in 15 here, give you an idea of how that kind of looks. And then you can physically move the camera forward if you want. But, with this shot in particular, just because the house is so far back and because the sort of roadway is really quite long, honestly, about where we had it might actually be best. We can leave it in around 30 and just kind of reposition the camera and then restore that. Again, you want something that looks neutral and doesn't show a huge amount of distortion. Let's try, we can adjust this with the field of view as well. Field of view and focal length will work effectively hand in hand. And so we're just going to position the camera in a nice spot like that. I think that looks pretty good. If we want to put the grid up here, we can also do that as well. And that's going to be under, I think, display. And this is just a nice way to frame up your shots. Try and get these points where it's basically rule of thirds, right? You're trying to get where the 4 points will kind of line up nicely. And that should give you a pretty nice balanced shot. Okay, I'm going to hit refresh here, and then I think we're pretty much just going to go ahead and render this. Again, if you've made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully you picked up some useful content, or at least maybe some nice little tips or something for you. All right, let's go ahead and leave it there, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.